She didn't cry when she signed the papers. That part always surprised people when she told the story later. They expected tears, expected the dramatic collapse, the shaking hands, the ink bleeding through the page. But Marlo Hensley had already used up every tear she had 3 nights before, sitting alone on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, back pressed against the cold tub, hands over her mouth so she wouldn't wake the neighbors. By the time the divorce documents were spread across the kitchen table on a Tuesday in March, she was just tired. She signed on the line her husband's attorney had flagged with a yellow sticky note. She slid the papers back across the table without looking at the man across from her. The man she had loved for 9 years, married for 6. The man who had already changed his relationship status on Instagram 4 days ago to in a relationship with a woman named Farrah Quinton, a 26-year-old fitness influencer with 2.3 million followers, and a habit of photographing herself in places Marlo had never been taken. His name was Grant Hensley, and for a few years, she had believed he was the best thing that had ever happened to her. They had met at a rooftop party in Chicago the summer she turned 28. Grant was the kind of man who made a room feel like it was leaning toward him, tall, confident, with the kind of easy laugh that made you feel included just by being nearby. He was in commercial real estate. She was 3 years into building a small interior design firm from scratch, working out of a shared office space in Wicker Park, living off client deposits and hope. He found her on the roof deck, both of them reaching for the last skewer of shrimp on the appetizer table at the same moment, and he'd said, "I'll split it with you if you tell me your name." She'd told him. He'd smiled. That was that. The first 2 years were good. They were better than good. She moved into his Lincoln Park condo, and he came to every one of her firm's small milestone celebrations. The first hire, the first commercial contract, the first time a design she'd done appeared in a regional magazine spread. He framed that magazine page and hung it in the hallway without telling her. She had stood in front of it for a full minute the morning she noticed it, hand pressed to her chest, thinking, this is what it feels like to be chosen. They married in September. Small ceremony, good food, dancing until midnight. Somewhere in year 4, things started shifting in ways she couldn't quite name. Grant began traveling more, Nashville, Dallas, Atlanta, always for new development deals. He started coming home later. He stopped asking about her projects. He would sit across from her at dinner and look at his phone, and she would talk, and he would say, at the right intervals. And she told herself this was just what happened when 2 busy people built a life together. She told herself that for longer than she should have. She found out about Farrah in January, not through a private investigator or a suspicious credit card charge. She found out because Farrah posted a photo on her Instagram story, the 2 of them at a restaurant in Nashville, Grant's hand on the small of her back, both of them laughing, and someone who followed them both sent it to Marlo with a single question mark. She sat with her phone for 11 minutes before she called him. He answered on the second ring. "I saw the photo," she said. There was a pause that told her everything. Then, "Marlo, it's not." "Don't," she said. Just that word. Don't. He came home the next morning. He stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and told her he was sorry, that it had started 6 months ago, that he hadn't meant for it to go this far. He said the word connection 4 times. He said he felt like they had grown apart. He said he hoped she could understand. She asked him to leave. He asked if they could try counseling. She said no. He said he was going to stay with a friend for a while and that he hoped they could handle this like adults. She had wanted to throw something at him for that. But she just said, fine, and she watched him pack a bag, and she stood at the window and watched his car pull out of the driveway. 3 weeks later, his attorney called hers. Grant wanted to move quickly. He was prepared to be generous, his attorney said, with an emphasis that suggested he expected gratitude. He was offering her a settlement that covered 6 months of expenses and her half of the equity in the condo, which she was welcome to put toward finding a new place to start fresh. In return, he wanted a mutual non-disparagement clause, meaning she would not discuss the circumstances of the marriage's end with anyone in their professional circles. What he meant was, don't tell people why. What he meant was, let him move on with Farrah Quinton without his colleagues knowing he had spent 6 months lying. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia she had found through a friend, told her she could push for more. The non-disparagement clause alone was a bargaining chip. She had been contributing to his career infrastructure in ways that were harder to quantify. The client dinners she'd organized, the contact network she'd helped him build by introducing him to her own industry connections, the years of emotional labor that had kept the household running while he traveled. Patricia said they could argue for significantly more. Marlowe had asked, quietly, what significantly more looked like. Patricia told her. Grant's attorney called back within 48 hours and revised the offer downward, adding language that suggested Marlowe had been uncooperative. Patricia told her they could fight it. Marlowe looked at the stack of papers on her desk, looked at the revised numbers, and thought about what another 6 months of this would cost her. Not in money, but in the thing inside her chest that had already been hollowed out to a particular quietness. She signed. She told herself it was over. She told herself she would be fine. What she didn't tell anyone, what she hadn't told Patricia, hadn't told her sister, a single person, was that 2 weeks before she signed those papers, she had taken a pregnancy test at 7 in the morning, standing in the bathroom of the condo she was about to give up, and the result had been positive. She was 11 weeks along. The timing made it Grant's. There was no question. She had stood there holding the test for a very long time. Then she had put it in the bottom of the trash can under a wad of paper towels, washed her hands, and gone to her desk to answer client emails. The reason she hadn't told anyone was simpler and more complicated than it sounds. She knew what would happen if she told Patricia. The attorney would use it. It would become a legal instrument, a point of leverage. And Grant would become something she had to negotiate with for the next 18 years. His attorney would turn it into a fight. His mother, who had been carefully polite to Marlowe for 6 years, without ever quite warming to her, would suddenly become interested. And Grant, she knew Grant, would do whatever his attorney advised, which might mean involvement, or it might mean a counterclaim that this was somehow her fault, her timing, her intention. She didn't want to negotiate. She was so tired of negotiating. She signed the papers. She gave up the condo. She moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Evanston that cost more than it should have and smelled like old carpet in the hallway. She had the baby alone. Not entirely alone, technically. She had her sister Donna, who drove down from Milwaukee twice during the 3rd trimester and stayed on the pull-out couch the week before the due date. She had her OB, a calm and straightforward woman who never made her feel pitied. She had her firm, which she kept running throughout the pregnancy, taking video calls from her home office in her 3rd trimester, telling clients it was her new remote setup. But no one held her hand in the delivery room. No one was there at 3:40 in the morning when the nurse put a 7-pound girl into her arms and Marlowe looked down at this small, wrinkled, furious face and felt something open in her chest that she hadn't known was closed. She named her Clara. She did not put Grant's name on the birth certificate. She told herself she would figure out the rest later. She met Eli Sutherland by accident, the way most things that matter seem to happen. Clara was 4 months old. It was a Thursday in October, cold enough for a coat, but not yet cold enough for the heavy one. And Marlowe had taken Clara out in the stroller for the first time in a week, because she had not spoken to another adult in 4 days, and she was starting to talk to the plants. She walked to the coffee shop 3 blocks from her apartment, the one that had an accessible ramp, because she'd learned quickly that the cute places with steps were useless when you had a stroller. She was trying to open the door and manage the stroller at the same time, which was one of those tasks that looked simple from the outside, and was actually a full physical negotiation, when a hand came past her shoulder and held the door open. "I've got it," the man said. She looked up. He was maybe 40, maybe a little older, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a lot of time outdoors or a lot of time thinking hard, possibly both. He was wearing a jacket that had seen better days and holding a folded newspaper under one arm, which she noted only because no one under 60 bought a physical newspaper anymore. "Thank you," she said. He held the door while she maneuvered the stroller through. And then he went to the counter and she went to the table near the window. And that should have been the end of it. Except Clara started crying. Not the polite, manageable crying that could be soothed with a pacifier. The full, Committed, world-is-ending crying that turned every head in the room and made Marlo feel her face go hot, even though she knew, rationally, that babies cried and it wasn't her fault, and no one in this coffee shop was actually judging her. She picked Clara up and bounced her the way that sometimes worked. And Clara screamed directly into her ear, and Marlo's untouched coffee sat on the table going cold. "Do you want me to hold her while you drink that?" The man with the newspaper was standing near her table. Not hovering, standing at a respectful distance, as if he'd stopped en route to somewhere else. His tone was mild, matter-of-fact, the way someone asks if you need help parallel parking, not like it was charity. She almost said no. She had been saying no to everything for months. No to her sister's offer to set her up with someone. No to her college friend's suggestion that she try a support group. No to her own impulse to ask for anything from anyone. Instead, she said, "She might not go to you." He shrugged. "That's okay." She handed Clara over. Clara, who had been screaming at maximum volume for 4 solid minutes, went quiet, not gradually, immediately. She looked up at this stranger's face with the specific focus that babies reserve for things that interest them, and she grabbed his finger, and she made the small grunting sound that meant she was thinking about something. Marlo stared at them both for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee. His name was Eli Sutherland. He told her this after she'd gotten through half the cup, when Clara had fallen asleep against his shoulder with the aggressive certainty of a person who has decided the situation is acceptable. He sat down at her invitation. She'd gestured at the chair, across from her without quite meaning to, and they talked for 40 minutes, which was 39 minutes longer than she'd talked to anyone outside of work in months. He was an architect. He'd moved back to Evanston 8 months ago after his firm had dissolved. A partnership gone bad, he said without much drama, the way people describe things they've already made their peace with. He was figuring out the next thing. He had a project with a nonprofit that built community spaces in under-resourced neighborhoods, and he did that mostly because it was the work he actually wanted to do. She told him she had an interior design firm. He asked the right questions. Not polite questions, real ones. And she found herself talking about a project she was proud of, a community health clinic she'd designed on a tight budget that had somehow managed to feel warm instead of institutional. She had not talked about that project to anyone in months. She had not talked about work to anyone in months, as anything other than reassurance that she was fine, she was managing, everything was okay. She was not fine. She was barely managing. Nothing felt okay. But for 40 minutes on a Thursday in October, with her daughter asleep on a stranger's shoulder, she felt something adjacent to fine. She did not tell him about Grant. She did not tell him about the divorce or the papers or the non-disparagement clause, or the fact that Clara's father didn't know Clara existed. She wasn't ready for any of that. She did give him her number. He texted her that evening. "Good meeting you and Clara. Hope the rest of the week is less hard." She read that text 5 times. The next 6 months were not easy, but they had shaped them in a way the months before hadn't. Eli became part of the shape. He brought groceries without being asked when she had a bad week, and mentioned it in passing. He came with her to a client meeting once when her regular assistant was sick and there was no one to watch Clara, and he sat in the corner with the baby and a set of board books and did not make her feel like she owed him anything for it. He did not push. He did not ask about Clara's father. He let her bring it up when she was ready, which took 3 months. They were sitting on her couch on a Saturday afternoon in January, Clara asleep in the next room, and Marlo said, "Her father doesn't know about her. I never told him." Ellie looked at her for a moment. "Do you want to tell me why?" She told him the whole thing. Grant, Farrah Quinton, the Instagram photo, the settlement, the non-disparagement clause, the pregnancy test in the trash. All of it. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been carrying that by yourself." "It wasn't a question, yes," she said. "You don't have to anymore," he said. Simple. No performance. She had not cried about Grant in over a year. She cried then. Not about Grant, exactly, but about the weight of the year, the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, the delivery room with no one holding her hand, the months of keeping it all in a container and not letting the container tip. She cried until her chest felt emptied out, and Eli sat beside her and didn't try to make it into something manageable, he just stayed. She was going to remember that. The staying. The call from Grant's attorney came on a Wednesday in March, exactly 1 year after she had signed the divorce papers. The attorney's name was someone she didn't recognize. Grant had apparently switched firms. The voice on the phone was pleasant, in the way that legal voices are pleasant when they're delivering something unpleasant. He said that his client had become aware that Marlo had given birth to a child during the period following the dissolution of their marriage. He said his client had reason to believe the timing was consistent with the marriage. He said his client wished to establish paternity and request a formal custody evaluation. Marlo sat very still after she hung up. Then she called Patricia. Patricia's voice, when she picked up, was the same calm voice it had always been. Marlo told her what had just happened. There was a brief silence. "How old is Clara now?" Patricia asked. 13 months. Good. We have documentation of his conduct prior to and during the separation. The non-disparagement clause doesn't restrict your ability to provide factual testimony in a legal proceeding. And I'm going to need you to tell me everything you didn't tell me a year ago, Marlo told her. Patricia was quiet for another moment. Then, "Marlo, you should have called me sooner." "I know. Okay, here's what we're going to do." The custody proceedings took 4 months. Grant showed up to the first hearing in a suit that cost more than Marlo's monthly rent, with a new attorney and a statement about his desire to be present in his child's life. Farah Quinton, who was now his fiancée. He had proposed in December, according to the engagement announcement that someone had forwarded to Marlo's sister, who had forwarded it to Marlo with 3 question marks. Did not attend, though she had reportedly told her followers that she was really excited to be a stepmom someday. The judge was a woman named Honorable Claire Desmond, who was efficient and fair, and who had very little patience for what she called retroactive parental interest. Patricia presented the timeline, the discovery of the affair, the expedited divorce, the settlement with the non-disparagement clause, the pregnancy that Marlo had been managing alone during the settlement process, the 13 months that had followed, during which Grant had made no inquiry, no outreach, no attempt to determine whether Marlo had continued the pregnancy. Grant's attorney argued that Marlo had deliberately concealed the pregnancy. Patricia pointed out that concealing information from a spouse who is actively engaged in an adversarial divorce proceeding, particularly a spouse who has inserted a clause designed to restrict her communication, is not a crime. She also pointed out, quietly, with documentation, that Grant had been photographed in Cabo San Lucas with Farah Quinton at 34 weeks into that pregnancy, appearing in a social media post that showed every indication of a man unconcerned with anything beyond his current circumstances. The judge looked at the photo. She looked at Grant. She looked back at the photo. The hearing recessed for 15 minutes. When it resumed, Judge Desmond outlined her preliminary findings. She said she was not prepared to grant significant custody rights to a petitioner who had demonstrated no awareness of, interest in, or support for the child during the first 13 months of the child's life, and whose petition appeared to coincide, suspiciously, with a period of increased public attention on his personal life. She ordered a 60-day evaluation period in which supervised visitation could be arranged if both parties agreed, after which the matter would return to her courtroom. She also looked directly at Grant's attorney and said, "Your client should understand that the standard for establishing a parental relationship with a 13-month is not merely biological. It is behavioral. Presence matters. History matters. This court takes that seriously." Grant's attorney said they understood. Marlo kept her face still. She had gotten very good at keeping her face still. Eli was waiting outside the courthouse. She had told him he didn't need to come. He had come anyway, standing near the bottom of the steps, with 2 cups of coffee from the place she liked. And when she came through the doors, he looked at her face and seemed to understand immediately that she needed a moment before she could speak. He handed her the coffee. She stood beside him on the courthouse steps and looked out at the street and breathed. "Patricia thinks it'll hold," she said finally. "She doesn't think he has the standing to get primary custody without a significant change in circumstances. The evaluation period is probably going to go nowhere because I don't think he actually wants to do the work of being a father. I think he wants to win." "There's a difference," Eli said. "She knows that. The judge knows that." She took a sip of coffee. Clara doesn't need to know any of this for a long time. He nodded. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she sometimes did when she was trying to remember this version of a moment, the exact quality of it. He looked back without flinching, the way he always did, without looking away or filling the space with something unnecessary. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay, why are you here? Not in a... I know why you're here today. I mean in general, this whole year. You didn't have to do any of this." He thought about it, which was one of the things she appreciated about him. He didn't give the easy answer, the one that was ready before the question finished. "Because you're someone worth staying for," he said. "And because Clara already looks for me when I come through the door, and I'm not planning on being the kind of person who disappoints a kid who looks for them at the door." She didn't say anything for a moment. "I'm going to need you to mean that," she said. "I know," he said. "I do." The evaluation period ended without incident. Grant attended 2 of the 4 scheduled supervised visits and canceled the others through his attorney, citing scheduling conflicts. The evaluator's report was filed with the court and was, in Judge Desmond's words, not indicative of a petitioner who has demonstrated sustained commitment to the child's well-being. Grant withdrew the custody petition in November. Marlowe found out on a Tuesday morning when Patricia called her while she was in the middle of feeding Clara breakfast. She set the phone on the counter and finished spooning applesauce into Clara's mouth before she let herself process it. Clara banged her spoon on the tray of her high chair and said "da," which was currently her word for everything she found satisfying. "Da," Marlowe agreed. That weekend, she told Eli she wanted him to meet her sister properly, not just in passing. She wanted the 2 of them in the same room at the same time. A dinner, something that meant something. He said he'd been hoping she'd say that. Her sister Donna drove down from Milwaukee on a Saturday and brought a bottle of wine and the directness she'd had since childhood. She shook Eli's hand at the door and looked at him for a long moment with the assessment that only an older sibling can perform, and then said, "Clara already likes you, so you've passed the hardest test. The rest of this is just formalities." Eli laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded. Marlowe thought about the version of herself from 2 years ago. Signing papers at a kitchen table, drained of everything, telling herself she would figure out the rest later. She had not known then what the rest would look like. She had not known about the 2-bedroom in Evanston, or the October morning in the coffee shop, or the man who would hold her daughter while she drank a cup of coffee and would somehow never quite leave after that. She hadn't known about Clara. She hadn't known what it would feel like to put a small, furious person in a car seat for the first time and drive home thinking, "I have to figure this out, and I will." She had figured it out. Not perfectly, not without loss, not without the kind of tired that settles into your bones and stays there for a season. But she had figured it out. At dinner, Eli told a story about a structural miscalculation on an early project that had resulted in a doorway that was 6 inches too narrow for the door they'd ordered, and Donna laughed. And Clara, strapped into her high chair at the head of the table, laughed too. That bright, specific baby laugh that sounds like it's happening just for you. Marlowe looked around the table. She thought, this is what it feels like to be chosen. And then, a beat later, no, this is what it feels like to choose. The difference mattered. She was keeping it.